Well, good evening. We have Mr. Jack Swigert here, more or less. Anyway, good evening, everybody. It's Max at Luna Replicas. We're going to flip the camera over now. Man, look how cool that is. Let's check the time here. What do we got? It is just about a couple minutes after 7, and we're here in Luna Replicas. Check it out, check it out, check it out. Oh, check out this cool microphone. Unfortunately, Facebook Live doesn't let you do external mics, so I got to use the mic that's on the camera, or on the phone. I'm going to turn this around one more time. Let's see what we got. A couple of new faces up here. Fred Hayes, Jim Lovell. How you guys doing? And I'm wearing a jacket here as an homage to Jim Lovell and also Jack Swigert in a way, because we're going to be talking about some watches today. We're going to talk about some watches and some cool stuff. First off, I want to show you guys we're putting out a new line of sunglasses. They are the traditional American Optical aviator sunglasses that we have, the original pilots with the green glass lenses. But we're actually engraving the serial number and the part number, the SCB number, right into the temple there. You see it's three-dimensional, it's gold foil engraved. They're really nice. It's a little bit different than what the standard NASA thing was with stamping ink. That is 100% correct, the stamp and ink. But these are now done in gold. So it's kind of neat. It's a permanent thing, a little bit more, but it's I think kind of a permanent thing. If you want a custom one too, actually we can do custom names and stuff as well. If you have a bachelor party coming up or something, or a birthday present you want to give to somebody, we can do custom names. You know, our buddy Brandon Franklin was the first one to do it. So, all right. What are we going to talk about today? Why is Max Peck dressed up as Jack Swigert? Well, for one thing, Jack was on Apollo 13, ran for Congress, won in 1982, I think it was. And unfortunately, he never served time as a congressman. He was a congressman-elect and died right before taking office. So here's a big shout-out to Jack Swigert. But part of the reason we're talking about Jack Swigert is the fact that he was one of a handful of astronauts who brought something other than an Omega Speedmaster into space. He brought his own Rolex GMT Master into space. We're going to be talking about space watches today. That is what today's thing is about. We can talk about some space watches. We can show you some space watches. We can show you some other stuff. If you guys have more questions, let's borrow Max Peck's watch right now. We're going to take this off his wrist. Okay. And I'm going to take this jacket off before I pass out, because it's 65 degrees today. Hey Pete, how you doing? All right. So, by way of a little bit of watch history, we're going to talk about some history of watches worn in space, and a couple of things that we offer that you can add to your collection, or you can ask us to help you add to your collection, something we might not carry. You guys might have seen recently that we had a Speedmaster for sale. That went pretty quickly. That was a nice homage version of Speedmaster that they did a few years back. About 20 years ago they did that watch. But let's talk about some space watches. Really neat about timekeeping is that watches in general, clocks and accurate timekeeping were designed so that navigation could be performed on water, crossing oceans, and consequently crossing the ocean by airplane and then by spacecraft. So it's a neat history here, and we're going to talk about a couple of the evolution of the wristwatch, of the watch watches that were worn in space, that were worn by aviators. Feel free to chime in with any questions or comments you might have. I know a lot of our watchers and listeners are pilots or watch collectors and stuff. I'm a pretty active member in a lot of watch collecting groups. Some folks I know sell watches for a living, and we can all have a nice time talking about watches today. So again, the history of the timepiece is one of accurate timekeeping. Really had to do with navigation, being able to tell the time precisely down to the minute, even down to the second. Actually, was very important, because with a nautical sextant or an octant, you need to know within the minute what time it is on Earth, so that you can find out where you are. A lot of logarithmic scales go into that, sine, cosine, stuff like that. But basically what it's saying is, at this second on this day, this is the angle of the Earth to the sun or other celestial body, the moon or another star. This is the angle you are to that object in space. Astronomers have put together an almanac telling you exactly where that is supposed to be at that exact time, and depending on your angle, you can find out where you're kind of backing into where you are. You know the angle, that the Earth is supposed to be at. Now you can find the angle that you're at using the sextant, and then you look it up in the book, exactly where you are at that time of day. Nautical almanacs are published every year. They change every year. Once you use a page, it's no longer valid. You go to the next page. So this is the type of stuff that started the need for accurate timekeeping. Prior to GPS, and even prior to some of the radio wayfinding that was available to pilots and to ships, starting in the 1930s and 40s, and GPS obviously later into the, I believe, in the late 70s, early 80s, and of course till now. Having accurate charts, having an accurate almanac, and having an accurate clock were the way that it was the only way you could find you could navigate across the ocean. So when in the 1930s and 40s, when flights were taking place across the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific, it was very, very important that accurate timekeeping was correct, not only in the airplane, but they'd have backups, and the backups were frequently a wristwatch. So let's take a look at just some of the history of the wristwatch. Now, prior to the 1930s, one of the major problems with the wristwatch was, or any clock, was the possibility of moisture and dust getting inside the case. So an early way that the military, at least, combated that was creating a very, very bulky case like this. This has this is called a tank watch generally, and it's just because it looks like, like a tank or a canteen almost. Canteen crown. This was an early way of taking a regular wristwatch and turning it into something that was a little bit more protected. In this case, it was really made for being able to go in the water. It was for diving and stuff. But if you keep water out, then you also keep dust and all sorts of other grime, stuff that would cause the mechanism inside the watch from slowing down or speeding up or not keeping the correct time. Again, a single second, 1 second being off, can actually translate to, I believe it's a quarter nautical mile of not knowing exactly where you are. Now, if you're navigating waters that have, that have underwater mountains or obstructions of any sort, quarter nautical mile can mean the difference of you running aground, or in an airplane, it can mean the difference of in cloud cover, you smacking into a mountain. And that happened. That happened a lot. Still happens sometimes, but that's very rare now. So, making a case that can withstand the pressures of water and keeping out the dust, keeping out dirt. This was an early version of it. This is an original 1940s military watch. I think this is Bulova. Yeah, it might be either Bulova and Elgin, Hamilton, major American companies. So an early adopter was, post 1940s, post World War II into the 1950s, 40s and 50s was Rolex and Omega. And one of Omega's biggest thing was the Seamaster line, and similarly the Submariner line for Rolex. They were basically the two competitors. Now Rolex, there's some interesting history with them. They were a Swiss movement, but an American company, and then there's some back and forth, where they made the cases, how they were assembled and stuff. Omega has generally always been a Swiss company. But the key here is that the watches were incredibly accurate. Within 5 seconds a day was what became Swiss accuracy. For a chronometer, for a ship chronometer anyway, it was almost, I think it was 15 seconds a week was Navy accuracy for a ship chronometer. So that might have been a larger watch inside a gimbal. But yes, it was a watch. It had a hairspring movement just like a watch like these do. So designing something for both underwater use and sky use. That's really what, for pilots, that's what Rolex did in the early 50s, the mid 50s, and Omega did it too. You have the Submariner, which is, well, let's see if we can focus there. Come on. Does this work? The Submariner, which is relatively unchanged. This is an older one from about 2001, but from 1954, I believe, till about 2010, the Submariner didn't change a whole lot. The case was the same size. The Cyclops there was added at some point in the 60s so that you could read the date wheel better, and that's kind of become its iconic look with the Cyclops on there to read the date. But the purpose of having the date was to make it easier if you're a world traveler, if you're diving, or if you're on a mission or something around the world. That was important. Of course, they have a unidirectional bezel, so you can set it to the minute that you go underwater, and then it counts down. It will not move in the other direction, so you can't accidentally bump it, and you find that the time, your bottom time has been bumped, and you're actually counting less time than you think you were. So that's the purpose of the unidirectional bezel. It only moves in one direction. So around the same time, Rolex came out with the GMT Master. GMT obviously stands for Greenwich Mean Time. It's very similar to the Submariner. It's basically the same case. It has some waterproofness to it. The Submariner goes down to, I think it's 1,000 feet, 300 meters. So about 1,000 feet water resistance. GMT Master's about 100 meters. So I forget what that is. It winds up being, or 50 meters. It's 100 feet. In any case, it's a sealed case, so it keeps dust and stuff out. But the big thing about this was the added hand there. That red hand is actually telling you on a 24-hour dial, whereas you have hour and minutes on a 12-hour dial. The red hand is 24-hour dial, and you would set that to Greenwich Mean Time and leave it, because Greenwich Mean Time is always the same regardless of where you are. If you're flying or you're sailing and you're going through time zones, it's always on Greenwich Mean Time, and you can make adjustments based on Greenwich Mean Time. This is really the first watch that was designed for pilots, commercial pilots or military pilots that were going significantly crossing time zones with a watch on their wrist. And that was huge. The Accutron astronaut was very similar. It had a 24-hour time there. You can't really see it, but that hand there is the 24-hour time as well. Minutes and hours is 12 hours. That's 24 hours. And the purpose of this bezel, unlike the Submariner, where it only moves in one direction, you're basically tracking the minutes of how long you've been underwater. This is omnidirectional. It moves in both directions. This one's a little sticky. I'm sorry. It moves in both directions. And what you're doing is changing the 24-hour time. You can change the time zone that this red hand is showing. So when you have it up in the center position, just like that, that hour hand is showing you 24-hour time on Greenwich Mean Time. So in this case, Greenwich Mean Time is about 2320 thereabouts, right? You see the 22, then 23, 23, 20. So it's almost midnight GMT. So say I want to change that 3 hours off GMT. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 21. That's as simple as it. That's all it takes. In the United States, 7 8. So we're about 1900 hours. That's U.S. time right there. You're just reading the outer part of the bezel. And this one has a black and red bezel, but historically they were blue and red like this. The Timex kind of copied that with this. This is a throwback version of one of the watches they came out with in the 70s. But that blue and red, that Pepsi dial, they called them Pepsi because of blue and red. And this is the Coke dial, which is, or Coke bezel, which is black and red. So Omega's response to this was something similar. This is not necessarily intended for pilots, but the Speedmaster was intended for racing cars and racing pilots. Whereas the GMT Master was for cross time zones, international pilots. This is really for racing pilots that needed to know within quick time, how fast they were going and being able to track their fuel and stuff like that. So what you can see here, the tach meter on the outside of the bezel, which does not rotate. This is a solid tach meter. What that tells you is when you time something with it, with the second hand on the chronograph, how fast it's going. So if something, you see 60 up at the top, if something is going 60, whatever it is, 60 miles or kilometers, it's going 60 of those. You time something how long it takes to go one of that. So 1 mile, you time it, it's going 1 mile, boom, you hit stop. If it did 1 mile in that time, it's going 150 miles an hour. That's what you're reading on the outside of the tach. If it's going 1 mile in 60 seconds, it's doing 60 miles an hour. Obviously 1 mile a minute, 60 miles an hour. 1 kilometer an hour is, 60 kilometers an hour is 1 kilometer in a minute. So that is how the tach works. Also, the Speedmaster, as you see, it carries the seahorse, or I think it's the hippocampus or something like that. I forget what it's called. But the seahorse is on the back of the Speedmaster. Why is that? It's a seahorse. What does that have to do with it? Well, the Speedmaster was just like the Rolex Submariner and the GMT being the same case, basically. The Speedmaster came out of the Seamaster line. They were rated to be waterproof as well. Granted, they're not as waterproof as a dive watch, but they are sealed, and they're designed to be waterproof. There are gaskets in the crown and the pushers. The bezel is. These are all waterproof. And so it's kind of neat to see an homage, or rather to see several companies doing basically the same thing. In the, this is 1950s through the 60s and 70s. Now, in the 1960s, during the space program, early on, there wasn't really a standardized watch. There was a watch and clock that were inside the Mercury capsule. I believe Alan Shepard or John Glenn are both brought up a stopwatch, just a wrist stopwatch. But NASA had not considered, or at least if they had considered it, they weren't really using them. They hadn't standardized a watch to wear for NASA purposes. So one of the first guys to bring up an Omega Speedmaster into space was Wally Schirra on Sigma 7. And he had his own Speedmaster. It was the older style like this. That's right, Mike. He had John Glenn had a Tag Heuer stopwatch. I'm not sure what Alan Shepard had, if anything. So he brought an Omega Speedmaster with him into space. Wally Schirra. They allowed it. He used it. It seemed to work fine. But it really prompted NASA to start a search for a reliable wristwatch that could be worn on the outside of the spacesuit. That would be, usable in all the environments that might be necessary for the Apollo program and the Gemini program. Ed White was the first American to step outside the capsule, and he wore almost this exact watch on the outside of his wrist. Off-the-shelf Speedmasters. They weren't modified. They weren't updated. They weren't redesigned. Nothing. They bought them from off the shelf. They made sure they were serviced very well and sealed and everything. They would service them constantly, and then, put on the outside of the suit and went out into space. And they did that all the way through the lunar missions. Bulova, a New York company, was not fond of the idea that a Swiss company was getting this military contract, so they lobbied by giving a watch to Dave Scott on Apollo 15, and Dave wound up bringing it up on his own, basically in his pocket. And when his Speedmaster, I believe the crystal popped off when they were repressurizing after the first lunar EVA, he put on his Bulova watch. Just basically, essentially the same functionality as a Speedmaster, almost exactly the same. A little bit bigger case, but same functionality. He put that on and wore that lunar EVA 2 and on Splashdown, and he sold it just a few years ago for a lot of money. And Bulova brought that watch back out. This is the watch that we carry. It's the quartz version, the electric version of their what they gave to Dave Scott on Apollo 15. Very nicely done, too. It's a stainless steel case. It's a sapphire crystal. Really, really great watch. Other than changing the battery and maybe a gasket every couple of years, this watch will last you a lifetime. It's got a nice weight to it. And for under $400, you can't go wrong. This watch, Speedmaster started about $3,000. This is, $400. Mechanical watches. Originally, anyway, they were all mechanical watches, except when Bulova came onto the scene and wanted to make history by creating an electric watch that was just as accurate or more accurate than a mechanical watch. And this is the Accutron. Bulova decided that they would put a lot of resources into designing a watch that could in the same space as a mechanical watch that has a lot of moving parts. These have a lot of moving parts. A lot of things can get broken when you drop it, or if it gets banged into something, if it gets dirty or dusty. A lot of moving parts. So this was a way. The Accutron movement is basically instead of having a hairspring that needs to be wound up, or a mainspring that winds up, that then powers a hairspring that vibrates back and forth at the same rate the whole time, and through an entire train that moves the hour hand and minute hand, and basically a gear reduction that's very, very accurate. Bulova said, why don't we take an electric impulse into basically an electromagnet that vibrates, goes back and forth like this at exactly the same speed all the time. That's kind of the basis of a quartz watch also, but it uses actual quartz that generates electricity at the same vibrations every time. This uses a electromagnetic tuning fork that vibrates at exactly the same amount of time. So it vibrates like this. It causes a wheel to turn at exactly the right rate, and that's what turns the second hand, hour hand, and minute hand. Accutron Astronaut. And they called it the Astronaut because they were selling it to NASA and the CIA that were flying SR-71s and X-15s at the time. They're the precursor to the SR-71. Also, I think this has a nice lume to it. Yeah, look at that. Anyway, also waterproof. They had, the case is sealed from the back. It only opens from the back, and it only has a battery compartment, and this is the setting dial. You just pop that up. This one's from 1969. Phenomenal watch. That's right, Mike. Scott Carpenter did use a Breitling Navitimer. Actually, he had, I don't have one here, but he had Breitling, which is a traditional also pilot watch, and they had a log. I didn't talk about that. Actually, it's a very good question. So like this has a GMT scale on the outside to be able to help see 24-hour time going across time periods or time zones. Breitling had a bezel that was actually a slide rule, and the slide rule helped calculate how much fuel was left in a tank, how far you had to go, without refueling, or whatever it was, a dead reckoning between points and stuff like that. They also had a chronograph as well, stopwatch. So Breitling was great. One problem with Breitling was they were not waterproof. So when Scott Carpenter on Aurora 7 hopped out of the capsule, actually it flooded the watch and killed it. And he subsequently sent that one back to Breitling. He had Breitling make a 24-hour dial for him too. It was normally it's a 12-hour dial. He had Breitling make a 24-hour dial, and it's now called the Navitimer Cosmonaut. And they're still made. I think they made a special edition for him, but the original one that he wore on that flight is lost because he sent it back, and they sent him a brand new one. So it's possible it's sitting in a Breitling office somewhere or somebody's shelf. But yeah, Speedmasters all survived their landings for the most part, and they did not get flooded. So a little bit of history here with watches from the early 1940s. They really started talking about doing waterproof watches, to the Rolex Submariner and GMT, which came out around the same time as the Seamaster and Speedmaster. Accutron, moving away from mechanical movements, but still having kind of the same functionality, or better functionality, actually. The accuracy of these was better than a mechanical watch. They use these, actually, it's a 214 movement is what it is. I wish I could open this up for you. It's really beautiful inside. If you ever get a chance to see, the manufacturing process for this watch is phenomenal. I told you about the tuning fork moving back and forth very quickly that walks along a wheel. That wheel, the teeth are so fine, you can't actually see the teeth. It feels like a smooth disc. The teeth are so fine, you have to see them with a microscope, practically. It still can't be made today. When they fix these watches, they're using new old stock parts because Bulova was putting this movement in everything. You could get a desk clock that had a 214 movement in it. They used them for cockpit clocks also. They were sitting in the dashboard cockpit of airplanes and spacecraft. Bulova provided the chronometers for Apollo and Gemini. The Space View. You can get a version of this watch with basically they've cut open segments of the dial and you can see the tuning fork and everything like that. It's really, really neat. Again, realize they barely had transistor radios. I mean, this is early 1960s. They're coming out with this stuff. There's still tube amps being used in every home, in most television sets and radios and stuff. This was with a single battery, creating time, or measuring time accurately. They made a diver version of this as well. Oh yeah, similarly, this has the bezel moves left and right. You can change the time zone, so you can tell 2 or 3 time zones with this at one time. Same thing with the GMT as we demonstrated earlier. And Timex kind of cashed in on the same kind of craze, the Pepsi, and they came out with this watch. This also moves back and forth. You can tell 2 time zones with that. Again, you figured prior to the 1940s, prior to even Charles Lindbergh, 1927, flew nonstop across the Atlantic. You didn't, changing time zones took weeks or months, depending on how you did it. So air travel, faster movement across the planet was the entire reason to have accurate timekeeping. And what's faster than an Apollo spacecraft going 24,000 miles an hour? The same watches were brought into space. I'll show you out of these. Those 4 different watches were brought into space. Now, the Speedmaster's counted twice, so those 4 watches were brought on the Apollo mission, at the very least. GMT Master. So Jack Swigert on Apollo 13, it was just the 50th anniversary. Jack Swigert brought his personal GMT Master with him on Apollo 13. When he came back, you can see pictures of him on the USS Iwo Jima. He's wearing that. A lot of astronauts wore these. Jim Lovell still has his. He may have brought it with him on Apollo 13. I don't recall if there's a photo of him wearing it in the spacecraft. His was given to him by the class of, I forget. He went to the Naval Academy at Annapolis, and on his dial has the crest of the Naval Academy. I believe after his Gemini 7 flight, his classmates gave him a GMT Master, and he still wears it. And he wore it on the Apollo program too. Jack Swigert wore his GMT Master on Apollo 13, and when he got back, Rolex asked if they could have it, and in return they sent him a solid gold one. So on Jack Swigert's, and he wore that till the day he died. On Jack Swigert's statue in Colorado, it actually has his gold GMT Master right there because he's wearing it in his post-flight photograph. Also, solid gold GMT Master. Richard, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean the Speedmaster was, the question was, did the Speedmaster set the precedent for future watches used on NASA missions? The Speedmaster was the future watch used on other NASA missions. They're still rated today for spaceflight. I think they're the only rated watch for going outside for EVA. There's also the Speedmaster, I think, of the X-22, which is a mechanical and quartz movement, and it has an LCD dial on the inside of it that can show other time zones and stuff like that. Those are still used. inside the International Space Station, inside the X-33. I'm sorry, yeah, X-33, not X-22. Inside the shuttle, inside the space station. It's not that important. Other than it's not that important what type of watch it is, other than the idea that it doesn't have a automatic movement. So what is an automatic movement? This is a mechanical watch. These three were, this is a quartz, but originally they were all automatic watches. What does that mean? You have to wind up the mainspring. You wind up a mainspring that generally has a power reserve of about 2 days. And then it winds down as the seconds tick away. It winds down slowly, but it winds down. There are some watches that have 8-day reserves. Some Omegas and the Seamasters and newer lines, and all of the GMTs and all of the Submariners have a weight inside, a weighted rotor inside the back of this watch. It's also a mechanical watch. You can unscrew the crown and wind it. You hear that? That's winding the movement manually. But if you wear it on your wrist, or you go like this, there's a weight that's spinning on the inside there that's also winding the watch. Now, how does that weight work in space? It doesn't really, so it's kind of superfluous. So you'd have to remember to wind the watch, because the weight might not, unless you really whip it around and get some inertia going, that might not actually wind the watch as it normally would. Theoretically, if you wear this watch every day, or at least every 2 days, you would never have to wind it manually. Just the movement of your wrist, if you're a relatively active person, if you're just walking around, you should be able to wind that watch fully during the course of the day. What happens with that, though, is that you're winding and unwinding and fully winding a mainspring. It can affect the accuracy of the watch, because the mainspring is not releasing at a known pace. You're constantly winding and unwinding, winding and unwinding. And the fact that an automatic watch can be very accurate is actually quite amazing. This watch, it unwinds at a steady pace, a known pace, and then you wind it back up. It's not changing constantly. This is changing constantly every time you do this, even if it's winding just a tiny bit. So the fact that they're accurate is really, really impressive. Any automatic watch. So that was kind of the beauty of an electric watch, other than the fact that you need a battery, and the battery can die, or batteries might not work in sub-zero temperatures, or in the vacuum of space. I believe those problems have been solved, but that becomes the squeaky wheel for this movement is the battery. Certain companies have gotten around that. Citizen and a few other, I think Seiko and other companies have come up with, instead of using a battery, it's a capacitor, which is basically a battery that can be recharged, essentially. And then inside the dial is a solar panel, and the solar panel will charge the capacitor. Actually, I have one right here. This is a dive watch that Seiko makes. It's a dive watch with a chronograph. And between the wheels here, where the logo is, 1, 2, 3, 4, about 4 places, that's all solar panels, and it charges a capacitor. And theoretically, if this stays out in the sun once a month, it can stay charged indefinitely. The capacitor never goes bad. I think they go bad after 20 years or something like that. There's other watches that use the same kind of rotational movement. They have a weight inside the back of the watch that charges that capacitor. So the weight will spin and then charge the capacitor up with a little generator. Same kind of idea, but but using the counterbalance or the counterweight of an automatic movement. Have those been brought to space? I don't know, to be honest with you. There's a great group on Facebook called Space Watches that actually has been cataloging every type of watch that has been brought on Apollo missions and Soyuz missions and stuff. There was a question earlier about what watch Yuri Gagarin wore. I believe he did. I don't know the answer to that. I'm not really that familiar with the Russian, the cosmonaut watches. Another thing here, so the Rolex has a date window. You see that? It says 25. That's a date window with a little cyclops on it, just a magnifier to help be able to see it. Speedmasters do not. Some modern Speedmasters do, but the original design of the Speedmaster, this does not have a date. What that's called in watch terms, a date window or anything other than just the hour and minute and seconds is called a complication. So this watch in this case has one complication. It's a stopwatch on top of it being a regular watch. So there's one complication. This watch has two complications. It has the GMT hour hand and it has a date window. So that's two complications on the GMT Master. I'm not sure how many complications this has. Probably just two, yeah. Just the date window and the chronograph. So, what do you do when you don't have the date necessarily? These little tiny wrist calendars came in very handy. They still come in handy, and they're still made, which is really cool. This is an April 2020 wrist calendar, and just like Walt Cunningham on Apollo 7, he goes and he scratches off the days after the day has passed. I do the same thing. But they come like this. This is the type that I use, is the H style. One side is gold, the other side is silver, depending on what type of watch you have, I guess. And you would just bend it around. I'm not going to do this one because here I'll use an April one. So you just take it and bend the tab around, bend that tab around, bend this tab around, bend that tab around, and there you go. It's very. I find it very convenient to be able to see the days of the week there. Michael Collins just posted on Twitter that he had drawn a little calendar on his on the inside of the command module Columbia on Apollo 11, and he would cross the dates off as well. There's another version that you can get. These are actually available on Amazon too. What's this? December 2020. So let's flip over here. February. Okay. So it's an oval version. It's a little bit longer, so you could put it on something like this. Same deal. You just line it up, bend it around, and there you go. Right there, it just disappears. But you look at the time. Oh yeah, look, today is April 25th. Any more questions about timekeeping or watches, stuff that was used on the Apollo programs or other space or historical clocks and watches? Always feel free to reach out and ask questions. There's a nice network of friends and space enthusiasts and watch enthusiasts that I'm in touch with. And if you're ever interested in any of these or more, I can generally get you in touch with somebody, or we could find one and put you in a watch that inspires you and makes you feel right at home, makes you feel part of the program. And what's really cool is, let's see. No. Let's see if this actually makes it. Let's see if you can get the loom shot. Here we go. Yeah, look at that. Luminous dials are very important. Here you can see that one, a little bit weak. Speedmaster, very nice. And the Bulova. Cool. Now you'll see the GMT Master, that one's dead. And the older Speedmaster, that one's dead. And why is that? Well, that's because prior to 1997, luminous dials were made out of tritium, which is a radioactive material, and prior to that they were made out of radium, which is also radioactive material. So you didn't actually have to charge them. Nowadays you have to, you know, sit them under a light or under the sun and charge them up. No problem, Richard. Prior to 97, they were, you know, they'd always be luminous, but they have a half-life of, you know, 20 years or something like that. In this case, let's see, what is the, yeah, if you ever see T less than 25 on these dials, see that T, it's tiny. T less than 25. That means it's a tritium dial, or in this case, the old Speedmaster says T, Swiss made T. That means it's a tritium dial. And they only lasted for 25 or 20 years. Is the half-life of the tritium. And then they would just die. They cannot be recharged. As opposed to modern dials, which are superluminova, which are not radioactive, but they have to be charged by a source. See, that was just charged by, oh, that's nice. That was just charged by the light over here. Let's see, this one, this is a 1976 Speedmaster. Oh, it'll hold the charge very briefly and then it's done. Yep. Here's a 2012 Speedmaster. There she glows. So that's really cool. Superluminova versus and this one, I guess this dial might have been relumed at some point, because that one was glowing pretty nice too. Oh yeah, yeah, that's a relume, but it's nicely done. And the Timex, believe it or not, Timex has a great lume on their dials. This is a, you know, it's a $100 watch. Some of their watches are $50. Great lume. Yeah. Any more questions before I turn this thing off? Feel free to ask. Once again, we are doing these new, these turned out really well. I really like that. It's permanent. And if you'd like one custom done with your name, or, you know, a date or something for wedding, anniversary, bar mitzvah, divorce, whatever, by all means, we can accommodate. I haven't posted it on the website yet, but that is in the works and very possible. So we're going to sign off now. I just wanted to show you guys once again. Also, the Apollo 13 caps came out really well. Pre-orders are still open. We can basically make them to order moving forward, but I wanted to do a big batch with these pre-orders right now. And here's some of the, oh, I got another imprinter machine. So we got so many orders for leather patches that I wound up getting another imprinter so I can keep up with those orders all on my own. All right. Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us. It's always a pleasure. Going to see, maybe we could do another one of these sooner rather than later. I know the last one was, the last couple have been kind of far apart, but it's been a lot of fun. Please ask me some questions. It's always a tough time coming up with content for these things for some reason. Though once I get going, I guess I can kind of talk about anything. Yeah, talk to you guys soon. Take care. Have a good one. Stay inside, stay safe, and be well. Bye.